In this tutorial, we're going to learn how to use Cinema 4D's MoGraph toolkit to make a particle effect that forms together to create text. You can also use the same effect to break apart the text and have it dissolve away, which you'll learn about a little bit later in this lesson. So let's get started. So we have just a blank canvas inside of Cinema 4D, and the first thing we want to do is drop in some text that we can work with. So I'm going to go up here to MoGraph, go down to MoText, and under Object, I'm going to change this from text to Digital-Tutors, and you can just change it to whatever you like. And I'm going to go to our depth here. I'm going to bump that up to around 40 should work. And I also want to increase the subdivisions here, so I'm going to increase it to about 12. All right, so now what we want to do is go up here to MoGraph, and we're going to drop in a poly effects. You can see that's drop into our objects panel here, and we want to click the poly effects and move it under the MoText until you see the arrow pointing downward, and we want to let go, and you can see that now that becomes a child of the MoText. If we open that up, we can see the poly effects there. So we want to make sure the poly effects is selected, and we're going to change these X, Y, and Z values to 0. You can see our text disappears, and we'll get that back in just a moment. So we're going to go into fall off, go to this shape here. I want to change this from infinite to linear. You can see that we get some particles on the screen here, but they're really not looking that great. And that's mainly because right now the orientation is set in the wrong axis. So if we select the Z handle here, we can move this, and we can see that the particles form the text, but it's actually happening in the wrong direction. So we want to go to our orientation right here and change this from positive Z to negative X. And now you can see that when we scrub this forward, the poly effects handle here, we can now see our text forms on screen from these little particles here, so it's looking closer to how we want. All right, so now let's go under here, we have the spline. I'm going to select this graph here. I'm going to right click, and this might be off your screen a little bit, but I'm going to go down and go to Spline Presets and set it to Square. All right, that's looking pretty good. So I'm going to select the MoText again, go back to our text here, and I want to scroll down and change this intermediate points from adaptive to subdivided. That might be off the screen just a little bit here. But as you can see, as soon as we do that, the particles start becoming a little bit more squared off. As you can see, if we had it set to how it was, which was adaptive, we have these long strips of polygons, which isn't really what we want. So I want to change that back to subdivided. All right, that's looking pretty good. So now if we select this poly effects, we can scroll this, and we can see that our text is looking a little bit better. Particles are starting to form here, but it's forming in a very predictable and linear fashion. You can see that as we scrub, we kind of can already tell where the particles are going to come from, and we want to just randomize this a little bit. So make sure your poly effects is selected, and we're going to go to MoGraph, Effector, and we're going to apply a random here. So we're going to apply a random effector. And as soon as we select that, you can see that now the particles are much more random. They're broken up. They're kind of coming from different directions here, and we're getting closer to the results that we want. So if I select this poly effects again, and I just scrub this forward, you can see that now the particles are starting to look better. We're getting smaller particles here, and they're starting to form our letters. And we can even start bumping up this randomization even more. So what we want to do is go back to our random and go into our parameters here. And under the X, Y, and Z, I'm just going to start kind of messing around with these values, and you can do the same as well. So I'm going to mess around with the X, Y, and Z, and as we dial this up, you can see that the particles start spreading apart, and now they're really coming from all different directions here. So if we scrub this again, now you can see the particles are really kind of just coming in from all different directions, and it's very random. So if we want to change this up just a little bit, we can go back to our fall off here. I'm going to change this fall off value and just bump that up. And now you can see that this little red box here starts moving forward. And if we move it all the way back, the particles, we get this strange deformation issue, but the particles are almost non-existent as we dial that back. But as we move it forward, you can see the particles start kind of increasing ahead of the actual movement. So now we can see more particles are starting to form. If we just select this, now we can see those particles are really coming from all different directions. And this I is starting to form before the G is finished, so that's what we want. All right, awesome. So we've learned how to use poly effects and the random effector to create a really nice particle effect that forms into the text. And if we want to take this a step further, if you want to have this effect dissolve, you could obviously keyframe this handle and kind of move it back there to have that dissolved, or you could just simply change the orientation from -x to +x, so now you can see the effect is actually dissolving away instead of forming. All right, awesome. Well, this was just one example of where you can use poly effects. You can really start experimenting with it and find other areas within your project to start utilizing it. Be sure to check back to the blog for more great tutorials.